Hello, 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 hello. Happy Thursday, everybody. Everybody. I am super well rested and nursing a hamstring injury, so hey. But we're back, quarantine story time, where we are using this shelter in place and / quarantined time due to the coronavirus to catch up on some classic literature that we haven't had a chance to read before. And what piece of classic literature would require more time than anything else? War and Peace, my friends. A lovely book in the public domain now by Leo Tolstoy. And so we will be picking up, just to make sure we have everybody online. I have the live chat up, so feel free to say hi. I also have the War and Peace playlist, if this is your first time tuning in. So you can catch up on any of the readings. And some of you guys may have noticed that the video maybe will go up live and then be on the playlist and then disappear and then come back. Ben's having some trouble with YouTube taking down the video and then reinstating it. So trying to figure out what the deal is with that, but definitely tune in when it's live, and definitely by the next day it should be back up. So there's that news. I guess we'll jump right back in. And as we know, what just happened was the Rostovs sent some letters and money to their son Nikolai, who is out at the front. And at this point, Prince Andrei Bolkonsky and young Nikolai Rostov and Boris, I don't know if he'd be considered Mikhailovna then, his sort of cousin, have all kind of interacted. And Boris and Andrei Bolkonsky are pretty close, but Nikolai Rostov seems a little bit like he's kind of fallen into this way of the military men he's with and sort of resents Andrei Bolkonsky as he sees him as like someone who doesn't actually do anything, where he himself didn't actually do anything, but has a sort of glorified memory of what actually happened in this battle. And I'm totally butchering all that, but that's all right. If you don't remember, just tune into the readings of, let's see, that was back in part 2. So definitely the end of the part 2 readings, the volume 1 part 2 readings, will be the battle if you want to refresh yourself on any of that. But right now we're in volume 1 part 3, and we'll be starting in section 8, and we're going to read 8, 9, and 10 today. So let's see how that goes. All right, thank you guys so much, and here we are. On the day after the meeting of Boris and Rostov, there was a review of the Russian and Austrian troops. The fresh ones come from Russia, as well as those returning from the campaign with Kutuzov. Both emperors, the Russian with his heir, the Grand Duke, and the Austrian with the Archduke, made this review of the combined 80,000-man army. Since early morning, the trim and smartly polished troops had been on the move, lining up in the field in front of the fortress. Now thousands of feet and bayonets moved with flying standards, and at the officer's command, halted, turned, and lined up at intervals, circling around at other similar masses of infantry in different uniforms. Now there came the sound of the measured thudding and clanking of the dressed-up cavalry in blue, red, and green embroidered uniforms, with embroidered musicians in the front, on black chestnut or gray horses, now stretching out with the brazen noise of polished, shining cannon shaking on their carriages, and with their smell of linstocks, the artillery crawled between the infantry and cavalry and settled in their appointed places. Not only the general in full parade dress, their waists, fat or slender, tightened to the utmost, their necks reddened by high-propped collars, wearing sashes at all their decorations, Not only the pomaded, spruced-up officers, but every soldier, his face freshly scrubbed and shaven, his equipment polished to the highest shine possible, and every horse groomed so that its hide gleamed like satin, its wetted mane lying hair by hair. They all felt that what was taking place was earnest, significant, and solemn. Every general and soldier sensed his own nullity, aware of being a grain of sand in this sea of people, and at the same time sensed his strength, aware of being part of this enormous whole. From early morning, strenuous bustling and efforts had begun, and by 10 o'clock everything had reached the required order. The ranks were drawn up on the enormous field. The entire army was stretched out in 3 lines. In the front, the cavalry, behind them, the artillery, further behind, the infantry. Between each kind of troops was a sort of street. The 3 parts of this army could be clearly distinguished from each other. Kutuzov's fighting force, in which the Pavlogradsky regiment stood on the right flank in the front line. The infantry and guard regiments came from Russia and the Austrian troops. But they all stood in one line, under one command, and in the same order. Like wind in the leaves, an excited whisper passed. "They're coming! They're coming!" Frightened voices were heard, and the bustle of final preparations rippled through the troops. Before them, coming from Olmütz, a moving group appeared, and at the same time, though it was a windless day, a light current of wind ran through the army and barely stirred the lance pennants and slack standards, which began to flutter against their staffs. It seemed the army itself, by this slight movement, was expressing its joy at the approaching sovereigns. A slight voice was heard, "Attention!" And then, like cocks at dawn, voices repeated it from all ends, and everything became still. In the deathly silence, only the thud of hooves could be heard. This was the emperor's suite. The sovereigns rode up to the flanks, and the trumpets of the first cavalry regiments rang out, playing the great general march. It seemed it was not only the trumpeters playing, but the army itself, rejoicing at the sovereign's approach, that naturally produced these sounds. Through these sounds, the one young, gentle voice of the Emperor Alexander was distinctly heard. He uttered a greeting, and the first regiment bawled out such a deafening, prolonged, and joyful "Hurrah!" that the men themselves were awestruck at the multitude and strength of the huge bulk they made up. Rostov, standing in the front ranks of Kutuzov's army, which the sovereign rode up to first, had the same feeling that was experienced by every man in that army, a feeling of self-forgetfulness, a proud awareness of strength, and a passionate attraction to him who was the cause of this solemnity. He felt that it would take only one word from this man for that whole mass, and he himself bound up with it, an insignificant speck, to go through fire and water, to crime, to death, or to the greatest heroism, and therefore he could not but tremble and thrill at the sight of that approaching word. "Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah!" thundered on all sides, and one regiment after another received the sovereign to the strains of the general march. Then "Hurrah!" and the general marched, and again "Hurrah!" and again "Hurrah!" which, ever growing and swelling, merged into a deafening roar. Before the approach of the sovereign, each regiment, in its speechlessness and immobility, became a lifeless body. But as soon as the sovereign drew level with it, the regiment came alive and thundered, joining the roar of the entire line which the sovereign had already passed. To the terrible, deafening sound of these voices, amidst the mass of troops, motionless as if petrified in their rectangles, the hundreds of horsemen of the suite moved casually, asymmetrically, and above all freely in front of them 2 men, the emperors. Upon them was concentrated the unrestrainedly passionate, undivided attention of this entire mass of men. The handsome young Emperor Alexander, in the uniform of the Horse Guards, in a triangular hat, worn brim first, with his pleasant face and sonorous but not loud voice, attracted the full force of attention. Rostov stood not far from the trumpeters, and with his keen-sighted eyes he recognized the sovereign from afar and followed his approach. When the sovereign had approached to within 20 paces, and Nikolai could make out clearly in all its details the handsome, young, and happy face of the emperor, he experienced a feeling of tenderness and rapture such as he had never experienced before. Every feature, every movement of the sovereign seemed lovely to him. Having stopped facing the Pavlogradsky regiment, the sovereign said something in French to the Austrian emperor and smiled. Seeing that smile, Rostov involuntarily began to smile himself and felt a still stronger surge of love for his sovereign. He wanted to show his love for the sovereign in some way. He knew that this was impossible and wanted to cry. The sovereign summoned the regimental commander and said a few words to him. My God, what would happen to me if the sovereign addressed me, thought Rostov. I'd die of happiness. The sovereign also addressed the officers. I thank you all, gentlemen. Every word Rostov heard was like a sound from heaven. With all my heart. How happy Rostov would be if he could now die for his sovereign. You have merited the St. George's standards and will be worthy of them. Just to die for him, thought Rostov. The sovereign said something more which Rostov did not hear, and the soldiers, straining their chests, shouted, Hurrah! Rostov also shouted with all his might, leaning towards the saddle, wishing to hurt himself with his cry, only so as to express fully his rapture for the sovereign. The sovereign stood for a few seconds facing the hussars, as if undecided. How can a sovereign be undecided, thought Rostov, and then even this indecision seemed majestic and enchanting to Rostov, like everything the sovereign did. The sovereign's indecision lasted only a moment. The sovereign's foot in the narrow, sharp toe of its boot, as they wore them then, touched the belly of the bob-tailed bay mare he was riding. The sovereign's hand in its white glove picked up the reins and he set off, accompanied by a disorderly swaying sea of adjutants. He rode further and further, stopping by other regiments, and at last Rostov could only see his white plumes beyond the suite that surrounded the emperors. Among the gentlemen of the suite, Rostov noticed Bolkonsky, sitting his horse lazily and casually. Rostov remembered his quarrel with him yesterday, and the question arose whether he should or should not challenge him. Of course not, Rostov thought now, and is it worth thinking and talking about it at a moment like this, at a moment of such feeling of love, rapture, and self-denial? What are all our quarrels and offenses? I love everybody. I forgive everybody now, thought Rostov. When the sovereign had ridden by almost all the regiments, the troops began a ceremonial march past him. And Rostov, on Bedouin, newly purchased from Denisov, rode at the tail end of his squadron, that is, alone and in full view of the sovereign. Before he reached the sovereign, Rostov, an excellent horseman, twice put the spurs to his Bedouin and happily brought him to that furious paced trot which Bedouin was prone to when excited. Lowering his foaming muzzle to his chest, his tail extended as if flying through the air without touching the ground, gracefully lifting his legs as high as he shifted them, Bedouin, who felt the sovereign's gaze upon him, passed by superbly. Rostov himself, flinging his legs back, drew his stomach in, and feeling himself one piece with his horse, with a frowning but blissful face, felt like the very devil, as Denisov used to say, rode past the sovereign. Bravo, Pavlogradskis, said the sovereign. My God, how happy I'd be if he ordered me right now to throw myself into the fire, thought Rostov. When the review was over, the officers, both the newly arrived and Kutuzovs, began to gather in groups, and talk sprang up about rewards. Among the Austrians and their uniforms, about their front, about Bonaparte, and how bad things were going to be for him now, especially when the corps from Essen also arrives and Prussia takes our side. But most of all, in all circles, they talked about the sovereign Alexander, repeating his every word and movement and admiring him. They all wished for only one thing, to go quickly against the enemy under the sovereign's leadership. Under the command of the sovereign himself, it would be impossible not to defeat anyone whatever. So thought Rostov and most of the officers. After their review, there was a general assurance of victory. Then there was a greater assurance of victory than there might have been after 2 victorious battles. Section 9. The day after the review, Boris, putting on his best uniform and with parting wishes of success from his comrade Berg, rode to see Bolkonsky in Olmutz, wishing to avail himself of his friendliness and arrange the best position for himself, in particular the position of adjutant to an important person, which seemed to him particularly attractive in the army. It's all right for Rostov, whose fathers send him 10,000 rubles at a time, to talk about how he doesn't want to bow to anybody or be anybody's lackey. But I, who have nothing except my own head, must make my career and not let chances slip, but avail myself of them. He did not find Prince Andrei in Olmutz that day, but the sight of Olmutz, where the headquarters and the diplomatic corps were stationed, and both emperors lived with their suites of courtiers and attendants, increased still more his desire to belong to that supreme world. He knew nobody, and despite his dashing guardsman's uniform, all these higher people going up and down the streets in dashing carriages, plumes, ribbons and decorations, courtiers and military, seemed to stand so immeasurably higher than he, a little officer of the guards, that they not only did not want to, but could not recognize his existence. In the quarters of the commander and of Chief Kutuzov, where he asked for Bolkonsky, all the adjutants and even the orderlies looked at him as if wishing to impress upon him that quite a few officers such as he hung around there, and that they were all quite sick of it. Despite that, or rather because of it, the next day, the 15th, after dinner, he went to Olmutz again, and going into the house occupied by Kutuzov, asked for Bolkonsky. Prince Andrei was at home, and Boris was taken to a large hall, which probably had once been used for dancing, and now was filled with 5 beds and various furnishings, tables, chairs, and a pianoforte. One adjutant, closer to the door, in a Persian dressing gown, was sitting at a table and writing. A second, the red, fat Nesvitsky, was lying on a bed with his hands behind his head, laughing along with another officer who was sitting with him. A third was playing a Viennese waltz on the pianoforte. A fourth was lying on the pianoforte and singing along. Bolkonsky was not there. None of these gentlemen changed his position on noticing Boris. The one who was writing, and whom Boris addressed, turned to him vexedly and told him that Bolkonsky was on duty, and that if he wanted to see him, he should go through the door on the left to the reception room. Boris thanked him and went into the reception room. In the reception room there were some 10 officers and generals. Just as Boris came in, Prince Andrei, narrowing his eyes disdainfully, with that particular air of polite weariness which says clearly that, were it not my duty, I would not talk with you for a minute, was listening to an old Russian general with decorations, who, drawn up almost on tiptoe, with an obsequious soldierly expression on his purple face, was reporting something to him. Very well, be so good as to wait, he said to the general in Russian, with that French pronunciation which he used when he wanted to speak disdainfully, and noticing Boris and no longer addressing the general, who pleadingly ran after him, asked to be heard out. Prince Andrei turned to Boris with a cheerful smile and nodding to him. Boris clearly understood at that moment that what he had foreseen earlier, namely that in the army, besides the subordination and discipline that were written in the regulations and known to the regiment, and which he knew, there was another more essential subordination, which made this tightly girded, purple-faced general wait deferentially while the captain, Prince Andrei, for his own pleasure, found it preferable to talk with the ensign Drubetskoy. Boris resolved more than ever to serve in the future according to this unwritten subordination, not the one written in the regulations. He now felt that, merely as a result of his having been recommended to Prince Andrei, he had at once become higher than the general who, on other occasions at the front, could annihilate an ensign of the guards like him. Prince Andrei went up to him and took his hand. Very sorry you didn't find me yesterday. I've spent the whole day fussing about with the Germans. Went to see Weyrother to check the disposition. When Germans start becoming accurate, there's no end to it. Boris smiled as if he understood what Prince Andrei was hinting at as common knowledge, but it was the first time he heard the name Weyrother and even the word disposition. Well, what is it, my friend? Do you still want to be an adjutant? I've been thinking about you meanwhile. Yes, said Boris, blushing involuntarily for some reason. I thought of asking the commander-in-chief. He received a letter about me from Prince Korrigan. I wanted to ask, he added, as if apologizing, because I'm afraid the guards won't see action. Very good, very good. Well, we'll discuss it all, said Prince Andrei. Just let me report about this gentleman, and then I'm yours. While Prince Andrei went to report about the purple general, that general, who obviously did not share Boris's notions about the advantages of the unwritten subordination, so fixed his eyes on the insolent ensign who had prevented him from finishing his talk with the adjutant that Boris felt awkward. He turned away and waited impatiently for Prince Andrei to come back from the commander-in-chief's office. You see, my friend, I've been thinking about you, said Prince Andrei when they came to the big room with the pianoforte. There's no point in your going to the commander-in-chief, said Prince Andrei. He'll tell you a heap of nice things, ask you to dinner. That wouldn't be so bad for service by the other subordination, thought Boris. But nothing further will come of it. There will soon be a battalion of us adjutants and orderly officers. But here's what we'll do. I have a good friend, an adjutant general, and a wonderful man, Prince Dolgorukov. Prince Dolgorukov. And though you couldn't know this, the thing is that Kutuzov and his staff and all of us mean precisely nothing. Everything is now concentrated on the sovereign. So let's go to Dolgorukov. I have to go to him anyways, and I've already spoken to him about you. So we'll see whether he can't find it possible to set you up with him or somewhere else closer to the sun. Prince Andrei always became especially animated when he had to guide a young man and help him towards worldly success. Under the pretext of this help for another, which out of pride he would never accept for himself, he found himself close to the milieu which conferred success and which attracted him. He took up Boris quite willingly and went with him to Prince Dolgorukov. And it was already late in the evening when they entered the Olmutz palace, which was occupied by the emperors and their retinues. On the same day, there had been a council of war in which all the members of the Hofkriegsrath and both emperors took part. At the council, in opposition to the opinion of the old men, Kutuzov and Prince Schwarzenberg, it was decided to go on the offensive immediately and give general battle to Bonaparte. The council of war had just ended when Prince Andrei, accompanied by Boris, came to the palace to look for Prince Dolgorukov. The headquarters personnel were all still under the charm of that day's council of war, which had been victorious for the younger party. The voices of the foot-draggers who had advised waiting for something else and not going on the offensive had been so unanimously stifled and their arguments refuted by the indubitable proofs of the advantages of an offensive, that what was talked about at the council, the future battles and undoubted victory, seemed no longer future but past. All the advantages were on our side. Enormous forces, undoubtedly superior to Napoleon's, were massed in one place. The troops were inspired by the presence of the emperors and straining for action. The strategic point at which they were to act was known in the smallest detail to the Austrian general Weyrother, who was leading the army. As if by a lucky chance, the Austrian troops had been on maneuvers a year before, previously on the fields where they were now to fight the French. The lay of the land was known and mapped in the smallest detail, and Bonaparte, obviously weakened, was undertaking nothing. Dolgorukov, one of the most fervent advocates of the offensive, had just come back from the council, weary, exhausted, but animated and proud of the victory won. Prince Andrei introduced the officer he was patronizing, but Prince Dolgorukov, giving him a polite and firm handshake, said nothing to Boris, and obviously unable to keep from speaking out the thoughts that accompanied him at the moment, addressed Prince Andrei in French. Well, my friend, what a battle we've been through. God only grant that one that results from it is as victorious. However, my dear, he spoke haltingly and animatedly, I must confess my guilt before the Austrians and especially before Weyrother. What precision, what detail, what knowledge of the terrain, what foresight of all possibilities, all conditions, all the smallest details. No, my dear, more advantageous conditions than those we find ourselves in could not be purposely invented. The combination of Austrian clarity with Russian courage. What more do you want? So the offensive is definitely decided upon, asked Bolkonsky. And you know, my friend, it seems to me that Bonaparte has decidedly lost his Latin. You know, a letter to the emperor came from him today. Dolgorukov smiled significantly. Well now, what does he write? Said Bolkonsky. What can he write? Fall-de-diddle-da, and the like, all only with the purpose of gaining time. I tell you, he's in our hands, that's certain. But the most amusing thing, he said suddenly, laughing good-naturedly, is that we simply couldn't decide how to address the reply. If not as council, and naturally not as emperor, then as General Bonaparte, it seemed to me. But there's a difference between not acknowledging him as emperor and calling him General Bonaparte, said Bolkonsky. That's just it, Dolgorukov interrupted, laughing and speaking quickly. You know Bilibin, he's such an intelligent man. He suggested addressing him as usurper and enemy of the human race. Dolgorukov burst into merry laughter. No more than that, remarked Bolkonsky. But anyhow, Bilibin found a serious title of address, a witty and intelligent man. What is it? To the head of the French government, au chef du gouvernement français. Dolgorukov said seriously and with satisfaction. It's good, isn't it? It's good, but he'll dislike it very much, remarked Bolkonsky. Oh, very much. My brother knows him. He dined with him, the present emperor, more than once in Paris. And hey, he told me that he never saw a more subtle and clever diplomat. You know, a combination of French adroitness and Italian play acting. Do you know the anecdotes about him and Count Markov? Count Markov was the only one who knew how to handle him. Do you know the story of the handkerchief? It's charming. And the loquacious Dolgorukov, turning now to Boris, now to Prince Andrei, told how Bonaparte, wishing to test Markov, our ambassador, purposefully dropped his handkerchief in front of him and stood there looking at him, probably expecting a service from Markov, and how Markov at once dropped his own handkerchief next to it and picked it up without picking up Bonaparte's handkerchief. Charmant, said Bolkonsky. But the thing is, Prince, I've come to solicit you for this young man, you see. But before Prince Andrei finished, an adjutant came into the room to summon Prince Dolgorukov to the emperor. Ah, how vexing, said Dolgorukov, hurriedly getting up and shaking hands with Prince Andrei and Boris. You know I'll be very glad to do everything in my power, both for you and for this nice young man. He shook Boris's hand once more with an expression of good-natured, sincere, and animated light-mindedness. But you see, till next time. Boris was excited by the thought of the closeness to supreme power in which he felt himself to be at that moment. He was conscious of himself being in touch with the springs that controlled all those huge mass movements of which he, in his regiment, felt himself a small, submissive, and insignificant part. They followed Dolgorukov to the corridor and met, coming out of the door to the sovereign's room by which Dolgorukov went in, a short man in civilian clothes with an intelligent face and a distinctive, sharply protruding jaw, which, without spoiling his looks, endowed him with a particular liveliness and shiftiness of expression. This short man gave the nod of close acquaintance to Dolgorukov and began peering at Prince Andrei with an intently cold gaze, walking straight at him and clearly expecting Prince Andrei to greet him or give way to him. Prince Andrei did neither. His face expressed spite, and the young man, turning away, went down the side of the corridor. Who's that? Asked Boris. That is one of the most remarkable and for me most unpleasant of men. That is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Prince Adam Czartoryski. My apologies to every Russian out there. It's these people, Bolkonsky said with a sigh which he could not suppress as they were leaving the palace. It's these people who decide the fates of nations. The next day, the troops set out on the march, and Boris had no time up to the Battle of Austerlitz itself to visit either Bolkonsky or Dolgorukov, and remained for a time with the Izmailovsky regiment. Section 10. At the dawn on the 16th, Denisov's squadron, in which Nikolai Rostov served, and which was in the Bagration detachment, moved from its night lodging into action, as they said, and having gone about half a mile behind other columns, halted on the high road. Rostov saw the Cossacks going past him, the first and second squadrons of hussars, the infantry battalions with the artillery, and then the generals Bagration and Dolgorukov rode past with their adjutants. All the fear which as previously he experienced before action, all the inner struggle by means of which he overcame that fear, all his dreams of how he would distinguish himself as a fine hussar in this action went for naught. Their squadron was kept in reserve, and Nikolai Rostov spent that day feeling bored and melancholy. Between 8 and 9 in the morning he heard gunfire ahead of him, shouts of hurrah! Saw some wounded brought back. They were not many, and finally saw a whole detachment of French cavalry led along in the midst of a Cossack 100. Obviously the action was over, and the action had obviously been not big, but successful. The soldiers and officers came back, told of a brilliant victory, of the taking of the town of Wischau, and of the capture of a whole French squadron. The day was clear, sunny, under a heavy night frost, and the cheerful brightness of the fall day coincided with the news of the victory, which was reported not only by those who took part in it, but also by the joyful expression on the face of the soldiers, officers, generals, and adjutants who went there and came back past Rostov. The more wrung was Rostov's heart, who had uselessly suffered all the fear that precedes a battle, and had spent this cheerful day in inaction. Rostov, come here, let's drink from grief, shouted Denisov, sitting down by the edge of the road in front of a flask and some food. The officers gathered in a circle, eating and talking around Denisov's mess kit. "Here they come with another one," said one of the officers, pointing to a captured French dragoon whom 2 Cossacks were leading along on foot. One of them was leading by the bridle the captive's tall and beautiful French horse. "Sell me your horse," Denisov shouted to the Cossack. "If you like, Your Honor." The officers stood up and surrounded the Cossacks and the captured Frenchman. The French dragoon was a young fellow, an Alsatian, who spoke French with a German accent. He was breathless with agitation. His face was red, and hearing some words of French, he began speaking quickly to the officers, addressing now one, now the other. He said that he would not have been taken, that it was not his fault that he was taken, but that Le Corporal, who had sent him to fetch the horse clothes, and then he had told him the Russians were already there. And to everything he said, he added, "Mais qu'on ne fasse pas de mal à mon petit cheval," and caressed his horse. It was clear that he did not quite understand where he was. He now apologized for being taken. Now, supposing he was facing his superiors, displayed his soldierly punctiliousness and a zeal for service. He brought with him to our rear guard all the freshness of atmosphere of the French troops, which was so foreign to us. The Cossacks let the horse go for 2 gold pieces, and Rostov, who now, having received money, was the richest of the officers, bought it. "Mais qu'on ne fasse pas de mal à mon petit cheval," the Alsatian said good-naturedly to Rostov when the horse was handed over to the hussar. Rostov, smiling, reassured the dragoon and gave him some money. "Allez, allez," said the Cossack, touching the prisoner's arm to urge him on. The sovereign, was suddenly shouted among the hussars. Everyone began running, hurrying, and Rostov saw behind him on the road several horsemen with white plumes in their hats riding up. In a single moment, everyone was in his place and waiting. Rostov did not remember and did not feel how he ran to his place and mounted his horse. His regret over his non-participation in the action, his humdrum mood in the circle of usual faces, instantly went away, and all thought of himself instantly vanished. He was wholly consumed by the feeling of happiness that came from the nearness of the sovereign. He felt himself rewarded by this nearness alone for the loss of that day. He was as happy as a lover who has obtained a hoped-for rendezvous. Not daring to turn to look while in line, and not looking, his rapturous senses felt his approach. And he felt it not only from the hoofbeats of the approaching cavalcade, but felt it because as it approached, everything around him became brighter, more joyful, more significant, and more festive. This sun moved even nearer and nearer to Rostov, spreading around itself rays of mild and majestic light. And he already felt himself caught up in those rays. He heard his voice, that gentle, calm, majestic, and at the same time so simple voice. As it had to be, according to Rostov's feeling, a deathly silence ensued, and in that silence the sounds of the sovereign's voice rang out. "Les hussars de Pavlograd," he said questioningly. "La réserve, sire," someone's voice replied, so human after the non-human voice that had said "Les hussars de Pavlograd." The sovereign's voice drew even with Rostov and stopped. Alexander's face was still more beautiful than 3 days before at the review. It shone with such cheer and youth, such innocent youth, that it reminded one of a boyish 14-year-old friskiness, and at the same time it was still the face of a majestic emperor. Looking the squadron over at random, the sovereign's eyes met the eyes of Rostov and rested on them for no more than 2 seconds. The sovereign may or may not have understood everything that was going on in Rostov's soul. It seemed to Rostov that he understood everything. But for about 2 seconds he looked with his pale blue eyes into Rostov's face. A soft, mild light poured from them. Then he suddenly raised his eyebrows, spurred his horse with a sharp movement of his left foot, and rode on at a gallop. On hearing gunfire in the vanguard, the young emperor could not restrain his desire to be present at the battle, and despite all remonstrations of his courtiers, at noon, having separated from the third column with which he was proceeding, he rode to the vanguard. Before he reached the hussars, several adjutants met him with news of the successful outcome of the action. The battle, which consisted merely in the capture of a French squadron, was presented as a brilliant victory over the French, and therefore the sovereign and the whole army, especially while the powder smoke still hung over the battlefield, believed that the French were defeated and were retreating against their will. A few minutes after the sovereign rode by, the Pavlogradsky division was ordered to advance. In Wischau itself, a small German town, Rostov saw the sovereign once more. On the town square, where a rather intense exchange of gunfire had taken place before the sovereign's arrival, lay several dead and wounded men, whom there had been no time to pick up. The sovereign, surrounded by his suite of military and non-military men, was on a bob-tailed chestnut mare, already different from the one at the review, and leaning to one side, holding a gold lorgnette to his eye with a graceful gesture, was looking through it at a soldier who lay face down, without his shako, in his head bloody. The wounded soldier was so dirty, coarse, and vile that Rostov was offended by his nearness to the sovereign. Rostov saw how the sovereign's stooping shoulders shuddered as if a chill ran through them, and how his left foot convulsively began to spur the horse's side. The well-trained horse looked about indifferently and did not stir from its place. Getting off their horses, some adjutants took the soldier under the arms and began laying him on a stretcher which had just appeared. The soldier groaned. "Gently, gently, can't you do it gently?" said the sovereign, clearly suffering more than the dying soldier, and he rode off. Rostov saw the tears that filled the sovereign's eyes and heard him say in French to Czartoryski as he rode off, "What a terrible thing war is, what a terrible thing. Quelle terrible chose qu'est la guerre." The troops of the vanguard were positioned before Wischau, within sight of the enemy line, which yielded ground to us throughout the day at the least exchange of fire. The sovereign's gratitude was announced to the vanguard with a promise of rewards, and the men were given a double ration of vodka. The bivouac fires crackled, and the soldiers' songs rang out still more merrily than the previous night. Denisov celebrated his promotion to major that night, and Rostov, who had already drunk quite a bit, proposed a toast at the end of the party to the health of the sovereign. "But not of the sovereign emperor, as they say at official dinners," he said, "but to the health of the sovereign, that kind, enchanting, and great man. We drink to his health and to certain victory over the French." "If we fought before," he said, "and gave no quarter to the French, as at Schongraben, how will it be now when he himself is at our head? We'll all die, and we'll gladly die for him. Right, gentlemen? Maybe I'm not speaking well. I've drunk a lot, but that's how I feel, and so do you. To the health of Alexander the First! Hurrah!" "Hurrah!" rang out the enthusiastic voices of the officers. And old Captain Kirsten shouted enthusiastically, and no less sincerely than the 20-year-old Rostov. When the officers drank up and smashed their glasses, Kirsten filled others, and in nothing but his shirt and breeches, with the glass in hand, went up to the soldiers' campfires, struck a majestic pose with his long grey moustache, while his white chest showing through his unbuttoned shirt, stood in the firelight and swung his arm up. "Lads, to the health of the sovereign emperor, to victory over our foes! Hurrah!" he cried in his dashing old hussar's baritone. The hussars clustered around him and responded all together in a loud shout. Late that night, when everyone had dispersed, Denisov, with his short hand, patted his favorite, Rostov, on the shoulder. "There is nobody to fall in love with on a campaign, so he's fallen in love with the Tsar," he said. "Don't joke about that, Denisov," cried Rostov. "This is such a lofty, such a beautiful feeling, such a—" "I believe it, my friend, I believe it, and I share it and approve." "No, you don't understand." And Rostov got up and began wandering among the campfires, dreaming what happiness it would be to die, not saving the life, he dared not even dream of that, but simply to die before the eyes of the sovereign. He was indeed in love with the Tsar, and with the glory of Russian arms, and with the hope of that future triumph. He was not the only one who experienced that feeling in those memorable days preceding the Battle of Austerlitz. 9/10 of the men in the Russian army were then in love, though less rapturously, with their Tsar and with the glory of Russian arms. And that's the end of chapter 10, or section 10. And I can't help feel there's like this sort of like big old bromance happening in the Russian army. Everyone's like, "Oh, I love you." Everyone's fangirling over the Emperor Alexander, and it's kind of cute. So yeah, there's that. So we'll stop there for today, and we'll pick up again tomorrow. And let me know if you have any comments. Like I said, I have the live chat up, but you can also comment on the video as soon as it's added to the War and Peace playlist, which should happen shortly. And if there's any problem with it, it should definitely be up by tomorrow. Tune in tomorrow for some more. Feel free to check out the War and Peace playlist to catch up on any bits you missed. Like I said, the last big battle took place in the end of part 2. So if you go back, you'll see I have them all numbered like 1 for volume 1, and then we've gone through, part 1, 2, and 3. And then there's also the section numbers, which are like subsections of the parts. So anything in 1.2, especially towards the end end numbers, should help you refresh about the battle if that was any question. And a reminder, some of the characters like Denisov have specific like vocalizations written in their wording. So like any words he say have extra GRs or GHs in them. So that's why I kind of give him a very specific voice, because Tolstoy actually wanted to have a very specific voice, which I think is kind of fun. So that, in addition to the random little bits of Russian, I'm so sorry to all Russian speakers out there. I've tried with most of the names to get them as accurate as possible, but that last one was really tricky. It's like C-Z-A-R-Y, C-Z-A-R-T-Y, O-V-S-K-Y or something. So quite difficult. If anyone has Russian pronunciation guides, feel free to drop them in the comments, and I will also be checking that out as well. But again, thank you all for tuning in, and we will pick up tomorrow. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks.